nerds, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and this is part 2 of my mini-series that I started last week, Top 12 Cards with Interesting Wordings, and the Implications of those wordings. If you haven't watched last week, go watch it now, because I'll be building on everything said last week with some heavier examples. Let's get right into it. Number 6 is Scout. I'm choosing Scout as an example of a phenomenon that appears often, and the idea is that there are behaviors, not words. What does that mean exactly? Placing something in play into your hand doesn't exist as a behavior. That's a return. To imply that placing something into your hand and returning it to your hand are different seems wrong to me because they both end up with the same result. Perhaps the difference is that return implies it was there before, like you couldn't return an opposing card to your hand, but you cannot do that normally anyway. And it isn't enough to justify the fact that Scout should really be return when the vast majority of their cards use the return keyword, and especially when compared to Mothership. Looking at these two cards simultaneously, it seems wrong that the two cards do the same thing but actually have different outcomes. One is a return, the other is a place, which matters to certain cards. But the bigger issue is the presence of instead of the discard pile, which Mothership shows is wholly unnecessary. Mothership just does the return, and it is instantaneous, and everything is fine. So what does instead of the discard pile do? This clause, which is never explained in the rulebook, actually defers the effect of what's happening until later. In practical terms, Scout is activated and queued to go to your hand, but does not do so until it actually starts to go to the discard pile. This is so confusing and unnecessary that the phrase was actually purged from Marvel, but it cannot be removed from past cards because certain cards now require it to prevent infinite loops. So this phrase would eventually establish a precedent that is now stuck in the portion of the game when Mothership shows it was never really needed in the first place. And the downstream ramifications have been pretty massive, in that they have greatly changed how cards work. Perhaps the pinnacle is the flock and first mate interaction and how this clause prevents flock from following, but the clarification is very heavy-handed and does more than it seems. I personally am very excited for never seeing this clause again in new cards. Number 5 is Galahad, the newest card on this list. Galahad is a knight at a time, quite literally. The clue is in the first part of the ability, which doesn't say to shuffle your deck, even though you do by rule. Marvel added it back in the card instructions to do so. But Marvel also added something that the second part contradicts. Marvel consolidated move and transfer, but Galahad brought transfer back. And I'm not sure why. If I had to guess, it's because it's consistent with the purging of the Marvel changes, but this is a bad idea in my opinion. It's not hard to wonder, if the Marvel terms and rules do not apply, does its card resolution order? Yes, I believe it does, but this is at best confusing and inconsistent, and at worst, it's a future problem. This goes back to my point about behaviors versus words. Repositioning a card laterally is a behavior, which Marvel calls move. That makes sense. To have two words that do the same thing, but one can potentially get blocked is wrong. At some point, there has got to be a base that prevents cards from moving off, because that just seems like a logical ability, but transferring would be allowed, which is a factor of what time the cards were made. To highlight the importance of consolidation, I'll ask this question. Without looking it up, which card repositions a buried card, move or transfer? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. If you said move, you'd be wrong. If you said transfer, you'd also be wrong. But wait, Bandit said cab over Pete can interact with buried cards. Yes, but going by the strict definition, neither actually references buried cards. Move says minions and titans, transfer says actions and power counters. Generic cards are neither. This is what happens when you get too specific on words rather than behaviors, and I thought that the move consolidation was a good change, but Galahad seems to have reverted it, so that it could be a problem down the line. Number 4 is Berserker of the Warriors, which is an example of a card that should not exist, because it draws attention to a very important rule in Smash Up, has an easy alternate wording, and doesn't take advantage of its existing wording. Minions who destroy minions fall into two categories. Fixed power destruction, like X or less, or variable power destruction, which is almost always based on minion quantity because it's easy to determine. But Berserker is an example where it cares about having power compared to the minion you are playing. I'll get to the alternative before I get to the problem. Berserker should be power 3 or less because otherwise, Berserker forces itself to ask a very important question. When do ongoings actually apply to minions entering play? What happens if a card like Full Moon or Sleep Spores is there? And this, in my opinion, is not answered well at all and has led to many anecdotal debates, the results of which would really surprise you. The Marvel Card Resolution Order succeeded in getting the Witness Rule added, but honestly obfuscated the resolution order much more by removing the numbered steps. The only guidance it offers is that a newly played card's unplayability is resolved before any other abilities on cards. Taken literally, this would imply that any changes in power don't happen until later, but this goes against what everyone feels like should happen. But the point is not to answer this question, which honestly, given the rule, could be read either way, and I can do an entire video on that statement which, when taken to the extreme, is really problematic. The point is that the question is unnecessary. There is no way to set this up in Munchkin, and Smash Up doesn't have any ways of having a card re-execute its on-playability again without leaving play first. So just have the Berserker destroy 3 or less. It does make me wonder if the original interpretation of Field of Effects cards like Howl was a factor, but this question is one that's just best avoided. Number 3 is a fun one, Mole. The mistake that's not a mistake that's really a mistake. Mole is not a special. Mole is ongoing. Mole is still before the base scores. We've seen in play before the base scores before as a special, like Pirate King, and that came first. But that's not a great example because the core set uses special badly. But Cthulhu's Chosen is also a special. Cards that have come after are specials, like Werewolves. But some cards that came after Werewolves were also ongoing. And even Goblins got in on the fun. So which is the mistake? Well, if you look at Mindraker, Mindraker blocks the playing of specials. This is interesting because in the context of Mole, in-play abilities would not be specials, thus they wouldn't be played. So that really seems to double down on this idea, but and stay down blocks the usage as well as the play. So what's going on? Really, the biggest question is, what's been happening lately? In Goblins, Magic Helmet is ongoing, but Blaster is special. Galahad is ongoing. This would imply that ongoing is the way forward, and anecdotally, this is what I've heard. This is how you can distinguish from an in-play special and an in-hand special. But personally, I think this is a mistake. Ignoring the question of when these abilities resolve, because I assume that they would occur at the same time as specials, even though they aren't specials, this distinction breaks the very idea of Black Trooper and the faction that cares about this most. This means that the Mega Troopers, the modern faction built entirely on this principle, is entirely wrong in their wording, and they will lose a ton of synergy partners in the future. Maybe this means Black Trooper is wrong, that it was never about the special, but always about being played before base scores. But imagine wording that. It isn't really clean at all. Strictly speaking, it also renders all these abilities to be counterproof unless they are in fact specials, but there is no rule to say that they are. Once again, what we have here is a behavior, utilizing abilities that occur before the base scores as an example of specials, and two fundamental ways of approaching it, but with drastically different results. Number 2 is another fun one, and one that can take a lot of time for people to really grasp. Rainbow Rock. Specifically, the term after the first time. There's always been a difference between once per turn and after the first time. After the first time has to be first, and it had to be the first, regardless of whether or not the card was in play to witness said result. For example, Jason. Say you play Mystic Studies with Archmage to draw 2 cards. Then you play Jason, then another action. If Jason were once per turn, he could activate, but because he's after the first time, that already happened, even though he wasn't around to witness it, even though he already knew enough to get screwed by it, but not be triggered by it. Yeah, that makes sense. But going back to Rainbow Rock, how many times can an after the first time trigger in one turn? The answer, of course, is more than one. How does that make sense? If the after the first time clause is qualified in any way, and the card is able to move, it will actually trigger multiple times. This is easily made an example by Rainbow Rock, who can move itself, and potentially gain 2 counters per turn. This became a precedent that also applies to Child of the Sun. To make this work, these cards need to be mobile, and need to have a base where you haven't done the thing as stated by the after the first time clause. After the first time typically works best when you need to have something occur immediately, but a non-optional once per turn would accomplish the same feat. But does this matter? Rainbow Rock is just getting an extra power counter, and people never complain about a card getting a power counter being too strong. Because Rainbow Rock moves itself, it can be useful, but this is definitely relevant with Child of the Sun, because those extra actions can be very impactful and can trigger each new base that Child of the Sun visits. I do wonder if we start to phase out this phrase when the location of the card ends up mattering. And now, my final entry. As I alluded to last week, this is crazy, and I want to start by saying that I don't personally subscribe to any of these interpretations because I know the clear intent, and I think the intent has to win out here. But this last card is an example of a common programming nursery rhyme, 99 little bugs in the code, which basically states that you have 99 little bugs, take one down, patch it around, 117 little bugs in the code. It's the law of unintended consequences, and this happens in spades with Sprout. Again, without looking, what is the wording of Sprout's errata? I'm willing to bet that almost everyone would get this wrong, because on accident, the place where most would go to look it up happens to be wrong. Check the rulebook. It never says that the ability is ongoing. We all just expect it to be, and therefore see an ability label that doesn't exist. And it's even in the app. But this isn't necessarily a typo to me, because all errata conditions contain the full text of the ability. I don't think it makes semantic sense as an ongoing. You have 2 points of reference that are in conflict with each other. When you are constantly checking, which ongoing does, it will never be the start of your next turn, because at the moment your turn changes, your next turn gets pushed back. It reminds me of the classic Spaceballs question regarding instant cassettes. When will then be now? Soon. So instead, it's an on-play ability, which creates a fixed point of reference for the next turn to make sense. And you may be thinking, what does this mean for the indestructible Sprout triggering each turn? What does this mean for Copycat? And these are all great questions, but the wrong ones. The question is, what does this actually mean for Sprout itself? What happens if the Sprout leaves play prematurely? This is where things get very dicey, because to my knowledge, there is no actual precedent for cards that have on-play abilities that occur later, especially as compound abilities. We come close with cards like Always Get Our Man, but never like this. This is an area where many people will start quoting rules that don't exist, but seem like they exist, so we have to look at the rules that are actually written. What do we know about on-play abilities? They happen, and their effects last even if the minion leaves play. This is part of Mind Lady's clarification. So that implies that Sprout's ability happens even if Sprout leaves play, because technically it already happened. So what type of ability does Sprout have? It has a do X, do Y. This means that you must do X and you must do Y in that order. If you cannot do one, you must still do the other. Now, we all know that the extra minion play is supposed to be at the start of your next turn, but does Sprout still need to be in play for that to happen? The issue is that these statements aren't linked by a to statement. This means they are independent. Sprout can survive the destruction and still search for the minion. So if the entire ability is queued until later, wouldn't the minion play be queued as well, and have it occur even though Sprout doesn't exist anymore? You may be saying, Sprout doesn't exist, so it cannot resolve. But this is the very principle that makes Sprout work in the first place. It dies first and leaves play, yet is still able to resolve the rest of its ability. This all assumes that the second statement actually occurs after the first, when in fact there is a way to read it differently. Destroy this minion at the start of the next turn. Okay, moving on. Search your deck for, etc. Consider the statement that on-play abilities with no specific timing are resolved immediately after playing the card. That statement, as a separate detached sentence, has no specific timing, so it could happen immediately. That's absolutely crazy, but in my opinion, the only way to actually make the on-play wording work like it is intended is to treat it like an ongoing, because there's nothing mechanically that says to go back and check for resolution. In fact, the rules even state that abilities can trigger at one point in time and take effect later. It clarifies that on-play abilities take place instantly when played. The ability has to trigger now because abilities without expiration expire at the end of the turn, and without that, the second part couldn't even occur unless it was pre-triggered. By the same logic, if you cancel the ability with Mind Lady, wouldn't it still happen because it happened? Or would the destroy happen but not the play? As you can see, this idea of deferred on-play resolution for minions creates a ton of issues and questions when you really think about it, and it's entirely avoidable. Here's what the card should say. On playability, cancel this minion's ability until the end of the turn. Then keep the original ongoing ability. This keeps all Sprout's original results except the immediate death. And if you cancel its ability while playing it, you also cancel the ongoing, so you cannot possibly play Sprout and kill it on the same turn. This is much more of a surgical fix and avoids all the other headaches caused by the unprecedented on-playability, so I personally choose to interpret Sprout as having this modified wording, and I encourage you to do the same. I still don't know what this means for the indestructible Sprout, but hey, it's closer to what we had before. Card wording can matter tremendously because the specific word choice matters. To be fair, my custom lawyer faction leaned into this intentionally, but I knew what I was doing. If we ever make a distinction between cards placed into your hand and added to your hand, I think I might actually lose it. With many of these abilities, it's better to consider them as behaviors and standardize on terminology. With others, the words we choose don't always mean what they think they do. And if you disagree on my interpretations on Sprout, which again, I do not endorse, what rules would you actually cite from the rulebook in your argument? Let me know in the comments. I know this is a pretty heavy video. I appreciate you sticking with it. We'll have a much easier and fun top 10 list next week. But for now, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.